This is the 30th in Kingdom Cassette Service recordings produced by the Federation of the Covenant People, P.O. Box 830, Honeydew, with a postal code of 2040, South Africa. The speaker in this address is Mr. Robin Hall, who is not only a member of the Board of Management of the Federation, but his many articles in the Covenant Message are surely appreciated by all. Mr. Robin Hall.
Private enterprise, fact and fancy. A favourite gambit of professional propagandists is to persuade you that a particular word or phrase applies to you, and then extend that word or phrase into a situation that bears little or no relation to the one put forward originally. On a moderate plane, we may admire and wish to emulate the rough and tough but clean-living cowboy who rescues calves from bushfires and motor cars from the edges of cliffs. But the extent to which you then go on to drink so-and-so's beer or smoke this or that cigarette is a measure of the skill of the advertiser, not of the quality of the beer or cigarette. We may be fervent as Christians and eager to put into practice the ideal of loving our neighbour, but the extent to which you may be then persuaded to apply the name neighbour to all and sundry without question is a measure of the skill of the preacher, not of the truth or propriety of the message he is preaching. So too, merely because your Prime Minister has attached the epithet free enterprise to the system he is encouraging you to live under, is a very weak reason to accept that at face value without further investigation. In accordance with the instruction of Christ to his disciples, when he sent them out as sheep in the midst of wolves, be ye therefore wise as serpents, it is necessary for us to examine closely every statement that is made on any subject, not only to see if it conforms or not with the will of God, but also to see if it conforms with the picture we have built up in our own understanding of the situation being commented upon. Who was it who said that in the past words were used to express thoughts, but that nowadays they are used to disguise thoughts? The loose language used by most politicians and by many preachers is occasionally accidental, in that the speakers do not know any better, but it is far more often used purposefully, in that they do not really want their listeners to understand fully what they are talking about. Moreover, it is always very much easier to get out of a promise if it has been imprecisely stated and understood than it is if the promiser and the promisee know clearly and concisely what has been promised. Therefore, a good understanding of the language and the intention used both by ourselves and our antagonists is a prime necessity if we are to give a good account of ourselves in any verbal contest. It is hopeless getting involved in a discussion on religion, for example, if it is not clearly understood what you mean by a Christian and what your opponent means by exactly the same term. A broad agreement that Christianity is a good thing is utterly useless if you mean one thing by that expression and your opponent means something quite different and possibly totally wicked. A bishop of the Anglican Church has recently given the following definition of a Christian in his church newsletter. Quoting Paul in Galatians 2:20, he said, "A Christian, Scripture maintains, is one who has entered into a deep personal relationship with Christ, so deep and so personal that it is nothing less than an identification with him in his death and resurrection." Now, the good bishop is entitled to form his own personal view and to use it in his private devotions, but in his official capacity he is only entitled to preach that which conforms with the word of Christ. Where else do we derive the word Christian? While denying to no one a deep and personal relationship with Christ, it is as well to remember the statements not of Paul, but of Christ. Firstly, in Matthew 15:24, "I am not sent but unto the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Secondly, in John 14:15, "If ye love me, keep my commandments." And thirdly, in Matthew 5:18, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law, till all be fulfilled. What do you do with a bishop who uses someone else's words to define a follower of Christ? How do you get through to him? How can you begin to argue with that sort of statement? Try one day to discuss the subject with your bishop, or your parish priest for that matter, on these lines, and see for how far you get. See to what extent he rejects the word of Christ, and to what extent his definition of a Christian differs from yours. But be warned, the word heretic is very easily attached, and the penalty of excommunication cannot be ruled out. If you try to get yourself involved in an argument on colour without knowing that you are a racialist, and why you are a racialist, and what is meant by that term, not only by yourself, but also by those with whom you are arguing, you will soon be in trouble from the anti-racial groups, for a person fighting against something he cannot identify is a very easy target. So when we come to the discussion of political theories, that is, the different ways that man has developed to keep his society intact, it is very necessary for us to know what the expressions we use actually mean. There is a large variety of words used to describe the different political organizations that have been invented or developed by man to govern himself. Some of the terms need careful study before the differences can be stated, and some of them are self-evident. But a non-extensive list will include monarchy, republic, oligarchy, that is, government by the few, democracy, government by the people, republic, government by an elected leader, dictatorship, government by an elected leader who will not give up his leadership, parliamentary, that is, representatives elected from whom and by whom the leader is chosen, executive presidential, where the leader and the representatives are elected separately, a constitutional, where the leaders do not trust the electorate and make sure that the rules conform to the game, totalitarian, in which you will be bound to put the state, or perhaps the government, first in all your activities, and anarchical, which is a totalitarian system when the leaders have lost control. Nationalist, originally stemming from pride in one's nation, but nowadays veering towards totalitarianism. Socialist, getting closer to totalitarianism. Communist, Leninist, Marxist, and Maoist, now we're getting somewhere. And peoples, that's just to keep you thinking you can play with the reins while the horse is standing still. Multi-party and one-party, there's no difference these days. Capitalist, that is, more money-powered than government-powered. Conservative, which means we must keep to the old values while changing with the times. Liberal, we must change with the times. Labour, times have changed. Right, right. Left, wrong. And centre, probably wrong too. It is very easy to get lost in the mass of possibilities, and very dangerous too, because one might find oneself supporting a particular type of government that you find eventually is totally unsuited to your and your family's needs, and uncomfortable for your and your family's activities. Ask yourself whether you would prefer to live in a country governed by a democratic, constitutional, parliamentary monarchy, or one governed by a democratic, one-party, parliamentary, constitutional republic with an executive president, and what the different effects upon your well-being and your comfort would be. Would you rather hope that your executive president would concentrate on executing his duties as opposed to executing you? Go about it the right way, and you will find yourself sliding into such a quicksand of verbiage that it will take all the Secretary-General's horses and all the Secretary-General's men to put poor Humble Dumble together again. Another favourite expression which has been much overused recently in South Africa, and no doubt in other countries as well, things being what they are, is free enterprise. Now what's he playing at? Surely free enterprise is a good thing. Well, yes, perhaps you're right. Perhaps free enterprise is a good thing, if what you mean by free enterprise is the same as what I mean by free enterprise. But what guarantee have you or I that we mean the same thing by that phrase as does the Prime Minister of South Africa? We have had the tendency to send up a cheer, have we not, that Mr. Botha is showing signs of right-wingmanship by his pronouncements on free enterprise and a partnership between the public sector and the private sector. But wait a bit. What sort of partnership is this going to be? And who is the private sector he has talked so much about and is relying on for his support? Mr. Botha's free enterprise is really a free-for-all and does not exclude the capitalistic, monopolistic, big business enterprise. Who do you think constitutes the private sector? And were any of the people you think are in the private sector amongst the 300 or so industrialists, financiers, prominent businessmen and politicians from South Africa who were in conference with many others of the same type from many different countries at the Carlton Centre, Johannesburg, at the end of 1979? Senior executive officials from the groups of companies most closely aligned with what we have called the conspiracy were there taking decisions that affect your future. And by reports from Mr. Botha's own lips, many of these have already been put into operation. Do these decisions really represent the views of the private sector? You will pardon the reader if he applies the epithet naive to you, if you think so. What do you, as a private individual, think will be the effect of their decisions upon your daily life? The free enterprise system that Mr. Botha advocates is indeed a strange sort of free enterprise, and is certainly not the sort of thing that we will approve. In fact, the inhabitants of Poland or Hungary will not be unfamiliar with some of the ideals envisaged in this supposedly free Western country. Mr. Botha has promised us all sorts of goodies as a result of our acceptance of his free enterprise offer, and so, from an extensive list, let us look at some of the goodies he holds out in his hand. You are probably already a subscriber to a medical aid scheme, and if you are not, there is reason to believe that a compulsory, national, and you know what that means, medical aid fund is on the drawing board. Hospital and educational services are soon to be altered, if they are not already, so that the only choice you have will be to attend a service which is open to all races, or to attend a service run by the government. As far as education is concerned, it is common knowledge that our great private schools are becoming increasingly multiracial, so much so that only 3 schools, one for boys, one for girls, and one co-educational, spring to mind as not having conformed to this. Ask yourself who is reaping the benefit of much money spent in these schools and why it was spent. Government, quasi-government, or conspiracy-controlled boards are now in operation to regulate the production, sale, and purchase of the following items: apples, bananas, beef, bread, bricks, butter, cement, cheese, eggs, fish, maize, milk, mutton, oranges, pork, not that that worries us, potatoes, sugar, timber, wheat, and no doubt some others which have been missed. If you look it over, you will find that everything needed to build a house and live in it is controlled in one way or another. Electricity, oil, and fuel, well, no one need tell you how much these items are controlled, nor need they tell you who controls them. Transport generally and the motor industry are regulated so that one way or another your getting around could be restricted fairly easily. Regulations are now coming in to regulate the type of housing you should provide for your employees, although the employers of most of us do not have to even provide houses for us. And you engage an employee these days without registering him at the local Bantu Affairs Administration Board at your peril. As this is prepared, the following news has just come in. Bricks and cement are to be increased in price, and so is flour, and so is sugar. This with no by your leave, no possibility of objection or discussion, but at the whim of one or more of those control boards. Another announcement is that cinemas are to be open to all population groups, presumably to tie up with the theatres, hotels and restaurants which have already been virtually thrown open in the recent past. You do not even have the freedom to buy toothpaste unless it has got fluoride in it, and if you do not believe me, go out to your local chemist and try. Even the much-vaunted budget we have had does not mean much. Granted, it appears that you are going to prosper from it. Oh, yeah. But please answer 3 questions. 1, which group of people is gaining most from the budget? 2, which group of people is still contributing most? And 3, who has been playing around with the gold price and why? In any case, the price increases mentioned above that are presumably a result of the budget have come into operation even before the supposed benefits of the budget itself. The price of petrol today at the local pump is 52.7 cents per litre. It will be interesting and instructive to see if there is any change between now and when you hear this recording. You are being lined up to pay for a good many things from which you will not benefit, and in normal circles that constitutes a crime. You are not permitted to take part in the production, sale or purchase of a vast range of items without following a strict selection of controls and regulations. There is a government monopoly on radio and television and a free enterprise monopoly on all the major newspapers and magazines. School teachers have been forced by government legislation to join a teachers' council, and trade unions are proliferating. You cannot build a cottage or a cesspit without having some busybody come along to see that you are building it right and to make sure you are obeying the rules. You cannot harness your own waterfall on your own land to produce more than a nominal supply of electricity, and woe betide you if you sell it to someone else. And if you find gold or diamonds on your land, watch out. It is easy for political scientists to blind you with their science. You are unfamiliar with their language, you are unfamiliar with their theoretical approach, and you are unfamiliar with their dialectical ability. They have been trained or have trained themselves to suspend their judgment, to attack an argument cold-bloodedly as if it does not really affect them, as if they were examining animals in a cage and could go home afterwards to a nice hot supper and not have to think about the dear until after breakfast tomorrow morning. They have been trained or have trained themselves in the ability of being able to explain difficult and wicked precepts in terms of easy and good similars. Very few people in the street have sufficient familiarity with enough of the terms used above in connection with the different types of government to be able to find their way unerringly through the maze, choose a satisfactory and viable possibility, and argue in its favour. It is much more simple to allow the science to wash over you, to place your faith in the experts, rely upon them for your learned-sounding quotations, and make use of a general consensus of opinion to rule your thoughts. Over the ages, it has been a fault peculiar to our peculiar people that they prefer to accept without question statements that appear popular or authoritative, and to repeat these statements as facts in support of an argument without investigating the popularity or the authority of the statements to their sources. We have acquired and have possessed for thousands of years a near-fatal impulse to be like other nations, forgetting that we have been developed by God to the possession of special attributes and qualities that make us totally unlike any other people, and that ensure that the mores pertinent to the rest are almost guaranteed to damage ours. The cry, "Let us do this thing because other people are doing it," has led Israel into many crises during the time of the nation, and the same cry is doing the same thing today even more so as the times speed towards their climax. There are explanations for this peculiarity, of course. In our genetic makeup, we are especially responsive. Primarily, this responsiveness should be towards God, and quite frankly, all we really need to do to get our nation back onto the right paths is for us to redevelop this God responsiveness as a nation, or even as parts of a nation, thereby rediscovering our purpose and re-engaging the motivating force behind our greatness. It is not really sufficient, on the other hand, for us to perform this as individuals, for throughout our history the emphasis has been upon a national as opposed to an individual effort. And it is the nation that has been given the purpose, the nation that has been given the guidelines, and the nation that must obey. Our special responsiveness, our basic goodness, even the very instructions we have been given, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, in Leviticus 19:18, even these instructions tend to make us listen to outside advice and be amenable to opinions from other directions. It is not for nothing that we have been referred to as sheep, and our instinct for straying, for following the loudest voice, or the most convenient way, or the method easiest to hand, is almost as damning as our refusal to pay God the obedience due to him. We possess a God-responsive gene. We have been commanded to look unto the rock whence ye are hewn, and to the hole of the pit whence ye are digged. We have been commanded to search the Scriptures, to look at the evidence, and yet our critical ability has become untrained through lack of practice. Our analytical muscle has been wasted away through a paralysis of disobedience. The fact that those who give us this advice and form these debilitating opinions for us have an urgent desire, natural or otherwise, for our final destruction just does not seem to enter into our heads. Sheep we are, and sheep we will remain, and as sheep we will follow the Judas goat into the slaughterhouse. We will follow anybody who can make up a specious argument right up to the butcher's cleaver and beyond. Appeal to our good nature, and you can have our head tomorrow and our soul the day after. Why is it so difficult for us to follow the still small voice, and so easy for us to follow the great and strong wind, the earthquake and the fire? In very truth, we ought to have learnt our lesson by now, after 2,500 years of pain, difficulty, and discomfort. But occasionally we do stop our lemming-like run, and we do examine our codes of behavior. Whether we actually get as far as comparing that behavior with the precepts laid down for us in God's Word is an open question. But let us hope and pray that as the time does speed towards the climax, we may become more amenable to the requirements of God and less willing to follow the traditions of men. Having followed this little byway on the faults peculiar to ourselves, let us return to the mainstream of our argument, which is centered around the types of government. Forgetting all that has been said to you in the past about the aspirations, the demands, and the requirements of anyone else, forgetting all the words that have been used to describe the various utopias made up by man for man, and in particular forgetting all the soft soap that has been spread by evil-inclined men who desire nothing better than your demise, what sort of government would you like for the running of your nation and for the safety of you and those closest to you? Are you content with the idea that one man should have one vote, that all should have a say once every 4 or 5 years in the governing of his country, and that having placed your one cross on your one piece of paper, you are then in the hands of that one man, and 200, 300, 600 more like him, without any recourse until he comes up again, if you are lucky, or unlucky, depending on the damage they have done, for re-election? What do you think of the man who crosses the floor, who changes his party affiliation, and does not present himself again to his constituents for reappraisal by resigning his seat? Do you think he is justified in retaining his seat as your representative, and continuing to draw his parliamentary salary, if he is not certain that his constituents will still want him as their representative? More important still, much more important still, do you think that God approves of the way that governments are chosen and run, still speaking in terms of what is called Western democracy? Do you think that it was part of his plan that the Westminster style of government should have been spread in a rather mongrelized form to so many countries of what is called the Third World? Do you think it should even have been started originally in Great Britain, or rather in the Britain that was once great? Are you happy with the thought that it is within the bounds of possibility that one of the most prosperous and most powerful countries in history should be governed by a man who has yet to satisfy many of his critics that if he is not responsible for the act of murder, then he is at any rate responsible for one of the most callous acts of culpable homicide that has yet gone uninvestigated? We are reminded frequently, too frequently, the lady doth protest too much, methinks, that the alternative is too ghastly to contemplate. Are you fearful of that alternative set of circumstances, and have you ever contemplated them, ghastly or not? Perhaps the present situation is bad enough without adding to our troubles. The United States of America, the land of the brave and the free, has a number of questions to answer in connection with bravery and freedom. Lytril is a non-drug foodstuff extracted from the kernels in the stones of apricots. It is said, by people who have tried it in the US and in other countries, to relieve the effects of cancer and even to cure it. There are, however, doctors and their nurses who have been persecuted, that word is correct, although they were prosecuted as well, in courts of law with other types of harassment for advising their patients to take Lytril. You render yourself liable to such harassment for obtaining it for your patients, and even for having it in your possession. Why? Because the Food and Drug Administration have declared it to be illegal. Is that freedom? The Olympic team has expressed the desire to go to Moscow in order to take part in the Olympic Games in 1980. Their president, oh villain, villain, smiling, damned villain, is trying hard as he can to prevent their going on account of the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. Setting aside for the moment the questions of the morality of the invasion itself and that of the athletes who wish to go to Moscow, is that freedom? The further moral question of the right of any government to poke its nose into athletics with money and ministerial responsibility, any more than it should into education, housing or waging, has yet to be discussed and decided. You would have thought, would you not, that in the land of the brave and the free, anyone who wanted to send his child to a school in his own neighbourhood, composed of children of his own and his friends' type, would be able to. Yet many thousands of US citizens have voiced their disapproval of busing without being listened to. Is that freedom? The average citizen in the United States has no say whatsoever in the final destination of the grain or military hardware or sophisticated computer systems bought with his hard-earned money by the all-pervading federal government. Is that freedom? The average worker in Great Britain, yes, I know there is a lot to be said against him, but he is not permitted to work if he does not have a union card in many types of work. He would find it very dangerous to work if the union leaders say strike, and he would find it very uncomfortable to strike if the union leaders say work. Is that freedom? If you are clever, talented, and hard-working, you may be able to build up a large sum of money in reward for your labours in some countries of the world. But in most countries, you will not be permitted to export that reward to another country. Is that freedom? Did the people of Great Britain really choose, really have a choice to go into the common market? You may remember that shortly before the referendum, it was announced that the Communist Party had instructed its members to vote no. In view of the fact that there are comparatively few Communist Party members in the UK, scarcely enough to have any significance in the referendum, is it not possible that this was a blind to frighten the public into voting yes? And if this is so, or for any other reason, is that freedom? There is a story going around, this is back home in South Africa now, that there was an old age pensioner who was lucky enough to draw two pensions. One was a military pension, and the other was from a firm he had worked for a short while. He and his wife had to subsist on 96 rand per month. That is about £50 or $100. Unfortunately, the firm who gave him the pension gave him a rise of 2 rands. The military pension was reduced by 4 rands, 2 rands for himself and 2 rands for his wife. Is that freedom? If an old age pensioner, and normally old age pensioners are the result of a contributory scheme, suddenly wants to go out to do a job, he may be active or wanting to help out, he is liable, in some countries, to lose his pension. Is that freedom? One of the most important features of the modern systems of government, and the same is true for virtually all of them, is that the individual loses his individuality. No longer is there much room for a man to take the responsibility for his actions, to pay his way, to step out of line. Even purchasing is being conducted by credit card, and the latest rumour is that they are thinking quite seriously of having your credit card number tattooed on your forehead. Is that freedom? We have heard of Vox Populi, supposedly the voice of the people, until we are blue in the face. First question: who makes up the Vox Populi? That's right, it's our old friends, the newspapers. If someone makes some world-stopping statement to you, and you ask them where they got that from, what do they say? I saw it on the telly. Second question: does anyone ever ask you for the full quotation about Vox Populi? Do you remember how harmful it is to quote out of context? Here is a translation of the full quotation from Alcuin, dates 735 to 804 AD. Nor should we listen to those who say, the voice of the people is the voice of God, for the turbulence of the mob is always close to insanity. Is that freedom? It has been said that the breeding ground for communism is the poor, inhospitable, unhealthy, and ignorant existence of the underprivileged, and the poorer and more inhospitable, more unhealthy, and more ignorant the environment, the more fertile the ground for the seeds of communism. Don't believe it. Communism breeds best and fastest in the universities and amongst the intelligentsia, in the places where people are too frightened by their position and too frightened of their colleagues to speak against it or even to think against it. By handing out more and more socialism, more and more welfare state, more and more public assistance, the upper crust is condemning the poor more and more surely to a worse and worse situation. Is communism the cure for poverty, ignorance, or bad health conditions? No. Then what is? Hard work, my friend. Hard work and the possibility of being able to ignite an idea that someone else will pay good money to take advantage of. With the welfare state, national health, and state education, it is not possible to take full advantage of this system. Is that freedom? You might be pardoned for supposing that it is not the alternative that is too ghastly to contemplate, but rather the original. Besides, what is the alternative? There is a sneaking suspicion that our lords and masters would have us believe that the alternative that is too ghastly to contemplate revolves around the murder, mutilation, rape, burning, and general terror tactics that we have been hearing about from Rhodesia, and that has been our daily diet on the breakfast table these past 20 years, imported by courtesy of the news media, I thought they would be there, from Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, Munich, Iran, Kenya, Uganda, and so on and so on. Have you ever stopped to think that these dreadful stories are designed to soften you up? Rhodesia was fighting, when she was fighting, with 9 fingers tied behind her back and both feet in a barrel of concrete. And yet she held up the forces of evil for 13 years until she was stabbed in the back by someone she trusted. America didn't have a chance in Vietnam after she was stabbed in the back by those she ought to have been able to trust. South Africa has the best part of 500,000 trained, under arms, or easily called up to military service. Do you think she would be unable to cope with the situation that is too ghastly to contemplate? It has been said that the Western democracies, including South Africa, are bastions of the free enterprise system. But the essence of the free enterprise system is that it should be enterprise, that is, bold or courageous action, by free men. That is to say, that any individual who comes up with a bright idea should be entitled, without having to pass through a whole mass of restrictive regulations, to take advantage of that idea and make a profit from it if he can. The disadvantage of the scheme, and what human scheme does not have a disadvantage, is that the lazy, the idle, and the stupid may have to go hungry. What a shame. No government is entitled to take away from the individual the responsibility of providing his own living, and no government is entitled to take away from the individual the possibility of providing his own living, at least in terms of the laws given to Israel by God. Properly applied, the Israel laws will ensure that there are no poor and needy persons, as we will bring to your notice in a short while. It is possible that this conflicts with some of the views you hold. Search the Scriptures properly, my friend. No one said to Jacob that he had to split his flocks up, thousands and thousands of sheep, amongst all the poor of his country. Are the blacks worrying you? Have no fear. Just as the government is not entitled to remove from you either the responsibility or the possibility of providing for yourself, so too they are not entitled to place you in any situation wherein you have any contact with a person who is not an Israelite. Indeed, part of their job is to see that you do not come into such contact. You cannot construct a free enterprise system by making grandiose statements about constellations of states and about interdependence. Constellations of states presuppose an amalgamation of interests and more controls to regulate those interests. Interdependence presupposes a dependence upon something or other outside your control, in direct contrast to independence, which means not being subject to any outside authority for your activities. Now, we just need to be a shade careful here, lest we be accused of advocating a system of unbridled license. Complete independence, that is, not being subject to any outside authority, taken to its ultimate conclusion, leads to anarchy. Israel means ruled by God, and within that context, and only within that context, we must, should, can, and will be independent. The only dependence Israel needs is upon the Almighty Father. A constellation of states means to a greater or lesser extent the mixing of the races, the mixing of the nations, and the mixing of the interests of those nations, whereas God has commanded that Israel should be separated from all other races, nations, peoples, and interests. But that is enough empty, negative, and sterile criticism of the apologies that go for current modern governmental systems. Let us have a tentative look at God's Word and see if it is not possible to extract the system of government that He would like us to live with. Political scientists are pleased to attach names to the systems of government they propose, and we are familiar, or we should be if we take an interest in such matters, with the Western system of democracy and with such things as a one-party democratic parliamentary republic. And therefore let us use the expression private enterprise theocracy to describe the system we are going to look at. It is a private enterprise system because God expects you to use your talents and abilities in order to run the system, and it is a theocratic system for the following reason. Have you ever paused to think that theocracy is really just the Greek translation of the Hebrew Israel? Just as democracy means ruled by the people, so theocracy means ruled by God, which is the precise rendering of Israel, ruled by God. The private enterprise theocracy. 1. There will be no president, and Jesus Christ will reign as king, having been given the throne by the Father. 2. There will never be any elections, nor any need for them, and no parliament. God has authorized no man to alter his laws, nor even to discuss them, and all we need to do is to know them and put them into practice. 3. Administrative posts will be hereditary and will be occupied by trustworthy men who will be disinterested and unbribable, and who will afford exactly the same standard of justice and dealing to all citizens, regardless of age or degree. This standard will be based upon a set and permanent constitution, the provisions of which will be clearly visible in content and operation, and will be known to all, being written in the hearts and minds of the citizens. 4. Finance will be governed by two principles. A. There will be no usury, and B. There will be a just, true system of weights and measures. 5. The trial and punishment of offenders will be organized so that the offender reimburses the sufferer by more than the original offense. If a man shall steal an ox or a sheep and kill it or sell it, he shall restore 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. A person who has shown by his actions that he has no place in the society will be excluded from it, but will not be permitted to become a financial burden upon the rest of the citizens. The principle of capital punishment will be enforced for certain offences. But beware, for with the same measure ye mete, it shall be meted out to you again. The justices will be entitled to, may even be encouraged by your opponent to, investigate your circumstances and actions while they are investigating those of the offender. 6. There will be an enforced holiday 1 day in 7 for the citizens, and an enforced holiday 1 year in 7 for the land. There will also be an assembly of all male citizens on 7 specified occasions during the year, and debts not repaid within the 7-year period are cancelled. 7. A set charge of 1/10 of increase will be charged upon each citizen for the running of the state, and no other compulsory tax will be payable. 8. It will be the duty of all parents, and they will perform this duty willingly and to the best of their ability, to bring up their children to approve of, appreciate, and follow the system under which they will live, and to perpetuate it in succeeding generations. 9. Landmarks and boundaries will be strictly attended to, controlled, and adhered to. At the end of the 50-year period, occupation of the land will revert to the person to whom it was first given. Land, in short, cannot be sold or bought, but can only be rented for so much of the 50-year period as remains. 10. An Israelite citizen can only be hired until the end of the 7-year period, and due attention must be paid to the regulations governing the duties and rights both of the master and the servant. These regulations include the hours of service, the amount and the time of payment, the period of indenture, the reward for good service, and the penalty for poor service. The hiring of non-Israelite labour is governed by a different set of regulations, but ideally there will not be any non-Israelites to employ. 11. Loyalty or love for God, for his system, for his people, and for one's family, in that order, is a preeminent requisite, and the citizen will be required to defend these objects of his loyalty, providing his own arms and keeping himself fit and trained in their use at any time. 12. As far as moral and social matters are concerned, the behaviour of any citizen is governed by the principle that he and his possessions may not act to the detriment of any other citizen or the possessions of any other citizen, and that he must make good or better such detriment as occurs. Each citizen has the right of appeal to the disinterested and unbribable administrators, and may call witnesses to prove the justice of his cause. Witnesses who deliberately mislead the administrators have a specially severe punishment reserved for them. 13. A very strong series of principles in the state system is that family matters and marriage ties are inviolable. This is to guard the basic breeding and genetic content of the race, and to ensure that a man's ancestors and descendants are clearly recognizable not only as Israelites, but also in terms of family descent, and the continuance of the national breed being paramount. 14. The word of a citizen is to be trustworthy, a yea being yea, and a nay, nay. Any oath or bond that is made must be fulfilled. By and large, within this framework, with very few additions, the citizen will be entitled to run his own affairs as he thinks fit, and without outside interference, taking his profit or his loss upon his own responsibility, no man gainsaying him. His profit, and do not think of profit as a dirty word, is his own and can be used for his own pleasure or further profit once the requirements of the tithe law have been fulfilled. He can lend or borrow money or goods, provided that the transaction is not usurious and provided he remembers the 7-year rule. He can manufacture any article, he can sell his labour or his talents for what he can get for them. He can sell the use of his land, remembering the 50-year rule, and conduct any and all of his affairs as he thinks best, without restriction from any other person, answerable only to God. It is no use expecting a long list of do's and don'ts in the ideal private enterprise theocracy system of government, because again, within the framework laid down in the Scriptures, the list is short. There is no need to spend up to 20% of your time, and therefore your money, examining government regulations to see if you're allowed to do something or other. All you have to do is to run through the principles behind the laws of God, which will be written in your hearts and minds, and you will know whether your course of action is valid or not. If you have the loyalty to the system required by God, you will not be disturbed by any feelings of wanting to bend the rules. If you have the confidence that all your competitors are also obeying the laws, then your profit will depend upon your talents and abilities, and not on the degree to which you can influence some officious government bureaucrat or gullible member of the public to give you a special favour. Your sales will not depend upon your erroneous and misleading advertisement that your toothpaste is the best, but upon the reputation that you have built up for a fair article at a fair price. The responsibility will be upon you, which is where it should be, for dealing justly, and the responsibility will be upon your customer, which is again where it should be, to judge your article or service at your price against those of other manufacturers at their prices, and you will have ample opportunity to undercut their prices if you can. This principle in particular, combined with a just system of weights and measures and no usury, will give a stable and economic financial situation in which a man can build up his own savings to provide for his old age and for his descendants if he wishes, which security is, of course, at the heart of 90% of the moans and groans about wages and salaries under the present system. Properly handled, properly not handled, the theocracy will have no need for charitable organizations and old people's homes. Each man, or at the very least each family unit, will be well able to provide for their own retainers and pensioners, and will still have enough resources to provide a basis upon which the next generation can build. There is nothing to stop a group of individuals banding together to provide hospital or educational services for the poor and needy if they wish to, but no state authority has the right to interfere in that, so that no one need go without health or education. But if one chooses, as one should choose, to be responsible for one's own health and education, then you will have a variety of differently priced services from which to choose, or the opportunity to create your own if you wish, or the opportunity not to be hospitalized or educated if that is your choice. Perhaps in those last words is summed up the whole tenor of the argument in God's theocracy. It is your choice. No one will stop you sitting back and not earning anything, but also no one will stop you working as hard as possible and earning as much as you can. Any one citizen will have the opportunity of using his talents, abilities, skills, labours to improve himself to the nth degree where n tends to infinity. And there is no limit within the framework to prosperity, to security, and to happiness. There are hard facts and flighty fancies about free enterprise. Do you feel that the fancies have become the facts, and the facts the fancies?